see, let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker this evening is Christy Mergenthaler, who is our very own stewardship director here at Southern Oregon Land Conservancy, and she is going to be sharing with us about some plants. She's an expert botanist. She's going to be sharing with us about two vilified plants, poison oak and mistletoe. Now, mistletoe folks often think that it is killing their beloved oak trees. And I think it probably goes without saying why poison oak gets a bad rap. But Christy is going to do her best to convince us why these plants deserve more respect than they get. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy.
Hello, everyone. I am here to give a short talk about two native plants. On one hand, a plant that upon exposure can cause great misery to human beings, poison oak, or on the other hand, reportedly a tree that sucks the vitality out of our sacred oaks, Oak Mistletoe. Well, off with their heads, or perhaps not. Perhaps species like this, inconvenient species that are pokey, slimy, smelly, poisonous, allergenic, scary. Perhaps species, all of them have intrinsic value outside of human beings and are part of the world and deserve some respect. So, poison oak, the scientific name is Toxicodendron diversaloba. Toxico means toxic, dendron means tree. Diversaloba discusses the diverse lobed leaves. There are a number of species of Toxicodendron in the world, and in North America, we have poison sumac that grows in swamps in eastern North America, poison ivy, of which there is a species in eastern Oregon and the gorge, and poison oak, which is abundant in western Oregon. There's also a tree that grows in China, the lacquer tree that is really important in traditional lacquerware in Korea, China, and Japan. All of these species contain an oil called urushiol, which happens to be an allergen just for humans, not other animals. Up to 80-85% of humans can be allergic to this oil upon exposure. Unfortunately, about 20-25% of us can have really bad reactions, while some lucky few have no reactions at all. They're in the cashew family, which includes mangoes and pistachios. And of note, the outer rind of mangoes also contains this allergen. So poison oak is a bit of a trickster. It can be a gigantic shrub. It can be a vine that clambers way up a tree, or it can be a tidy ground cover. Where we live in Southwest Oregon, fortunately, you don't find it above 4,000 feet, but you do find it in oak woodlands, shrubland, and evergreen forest. Sorry. Leaves of 3, let it be, they say. However, lobes of poison oak can have more than 3 lobes, or compound leaves can have 5 or 17. We have native plants like skunk brush that also have leaves of 3. It takes a while to identify poison oak in all its forms, including during the winter with this little white pumpkin fruits, but it's an important species to get to know. Why should we care? Well, poison oak is an important part of the shelter for wildlife, including a place for nest, a place to roost, and the flowers are important resources for native bees like mining and sweat bees, the pollen and nectar resources. It's an important browse, pretty high in phosphorus and protein. In parts of California, it is the #1 browse species for black-tailed deer. So if you're a plant and you want wildlife to spread your seeds through your fruits, one option is to have super juicy, delicious, sweet fruits that we all consume immediately, or like poison oak, persisting, nutritious fruits that last for a long time and are lower in sugars. Poison oak fruits are available late fall and winter and are very important for animals, including spotted towhees, California towhees, like the towhee pictured, bush tits, flickers, robins, and many other birds. On to oak mistletoe. I appreciate that people dislike oak mistletoe because they love oak trees. I'm glad we all love oak trees, but note that oak mistletoe, it doesn't outright kill trees. It's just part of the stressors like drought and mushrooms and disease outbreaks that can contribute to the death of a tree. Oak mistletoe is just part of the community. The scientific name is Phoradendron villosum. Phora means thief, dendron tree, so tree thief. Villosum means soft hairs. All of the phoradendrons are partial parasites or hemiparasites, which means that they're green, they make food from the sunlight, but they also store resources with special structures from the tree. In this case, water and dissolved nutrients. Here is a picture of other partial parasites. It's just a strategy of being a creature, a being of the world, and doesn't make the plants bad. In fact, some of them are very pretty. These flowers all make food from the sun, but they also steal some resources from their neighbors. The flowers are somewhat obscure, but they provide pollen and nectar resources late summer when there's less resources for our pollinators. And for one insect, the beautiful great purple hair streaked, their host plant only are phoradendrons or mistletoes. The female lays her eggs only on mistletoes and the larvae hatch, and that is their first food. Oak mistletoe berries, also fruit in the fall and winter, are a critical resource for our resident birds who like fruit, including western bluebirds, Townsend solitaires, waxwings, and robins. And not only do we provide cover and fruit for our birds, a suite of birds, the oak woodland birds that are declining, but structurally, an OSU study, Oregon State University study, demonstrated that large trees with many mistletoes on them support more bird species at a greater abundance than trees without. And this is because trees with oak mistletoes tend to be more complex in their microhabitats. They have more cavities and fissures and swollen branches. And as many of you know, in Southwest Oregon, less than 10% of our oaks are left. And part of the reason they're such great wildlife communities is because of oak mistletoes. Well, this concludes my talk about 2 native plants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristi. Now, up next, we have Olivia Duren, and she is an ecologist and a lover of shrubs. She is going to demystify the Chaparral Habitat, which, contrary to popular belief, won't just spontaneously burst into flames. So Olivia, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, are you seeing my slides? I should double check.
Yes, that looks great. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Kristi. That was a really interesting talk. So for my master's research, I studied chaparral outside of Jacksonville, Oregon, and this is my field assistant. And I married him, which is one reason why I love chaparral. In fact, my wedding ring was made by this man from the shrubs that we cut out of manzanita, which is a chaparral shrub. But another reason why I love chaparral is that it's part of what makes the Rogue Valley so rogue. Chaparral is also known as brush, scrub, maybe less polite names that you've heard. In fact, I recently read, in the hierarchy of plants, a shrub barely outranks a weed. And you may feel the same. I hope to maybe change your minds. Chaparral is essentially a dense, continuous carpet of shrubs of a certain species, usually those that are pretty drought tolerant. And in the rogue, it grows scattered in the valleys, but mostly in the foothills. One thing that makes Chaparral in the rogue special is that it's near the farthest northern part of its range, as you can see from this map here. And that makes it behave a little bit differently than farther south in California, even though they are the same shrub species. So different shrub species predominate depending on where you are in the landscape. But in the lower elevation foothills and valleys, the main species are whiteleaf manzanita and buckbrush ceanothus. That's Keith Perchimlides there in the photo. I don't know if he's on the call, but many of you might know him in an old growth manzanita shrub. And one thing that's really amazing about these species is that you can count the rings just like you would a tree, and they are surprisingly long-lived. Buckbrush ceanothus can attain ages of a century or more, and whiteleaf manzanita can get up to 146 years old. So kind of great-great-grandparent shrubs. Some of the shrubs over 100 years old were only 4 inches in diameter. But even when it's old growth, people love to vilify chaparral. And like much of the natural world, it's often very inconvenienced to human pursuits. It is certainly no fun to travel through, which I can attest to. And the early Euro-American settlers didn't have many nice things to say about it either. In fact, some people hate chaparral so much that they have claimed that it is unnatural and it is a recent arrival to the landscape, but there's quite a bit of evidence to the contrary. This map that you're seeing is a depiction of vegetation in the Rogue Valley at around the time of Euro-American settlement. And at that time, chaparral and other pure shrublands made up only about 1% of the landscape. And chaparral actually has about the same extent now, even though vegetation at any one spot has shuffled around over the last 150 years from one type to the other. So chaparral is not a very big component of the landscape, but it certainly makes a very big impression. Native Americans have found many uses for chaparral species. In fact, a friend of mine that grew up outside of Redding used to tell stories about how he would play as a kid in the tunnels in old growth manzanita chaparral that the Native Americans used to use to travel undetected. Chaparral used to be much more extensive than it is now, back when the climate was warmer and drier. Up to about 4,000 years ago, it actually ranged all the way to the Puget Sound, which we know from the fossil and pollen record. But the climate cooled and the chaparral range contracted to the parts of the landscape that are hotter and drier, including the Rogue. And so the Siskiyou Mountains have effectively isolated populations of chaparral in the Rogue Valley from those further south in California for about 4,000 years. And there is some evidence that those two separate groups are developing different life history strategies. So in California, buckbrush ceanothus and whiteleaf manzanita require fire to stimulate seed germination. But in the Rogue, as you may have observed yourself, they can successfully recruit new baby shrubs without fire, which in turn means that they have different strategies for dealing with disturbances in environments. And that is one way that the Rogue Valley chaparral is really unique. I have finally mentioned fire. If there's one thing anyone knows about chaparral, it is that it burns very well. And this is, of course, another reason why it has been vilified. Chaparral species are very resilient to fires, provided they are not too frequent. And there have always been fires on the landscape, of course, but now there are also a lot of houses in the wildland, and nobody wants their house to burn down. This house probably has a great view, but is in maybe not the best spot for wildfire risk. So the Rogue Valley has always burned. Then it's not really a matter of if it will burn, but when it will burn next, as we saw from last fall. And that happens whether chaparral is around or not. There are some good local resources for how to reduce fire risk for your home, which have to do with location, building materials, and maintaining defensible space around your home, which is one type of fuels management. When used strategically, fuels management can be an important strategy for creating fuel breaks that protect communities by changing fire behavior. But unfortunately, fuels management can often run amok and mow down old growth chaparral, just minding its own business, far from homes. Chaparral is getting clear cut throughout its range from Southern California to Oregon. And when you cut or burn chaparral often enough, you convert it to cheatgrass and other annual weeds. Which is really a shame because not only does chaparral help give the rogue its very particular character, it's also home to many sensitive plant and animal species, including Lewis's woodpecker and Gentner's fritillary. And studies have shown that these are lost when chaparral is cut down. Its nutritious winter deer browse. Increasingly important, these slow-growing century-old shrubs store carbon very well. And because chaparral is so underappreciated, it's pretty safe bet that you don't have to worry about crowds when you're bird watching or botanizing. So it's an excellent spot for solace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I just learned a great deal about chaparral. Now, I do want to take this opportunity to remind you all that not just our live speakers, but also our recorded speakers are all going to be on the call at the end for some Q&A. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. I know that when I'm watching these things, I think of questions while I'm listening, but then, you know, when the next speaker comes on, I move my attention to the next topic and I forget my questions. So we will be keeping track of those questions in the chat. So feel free to drop them in there anytime and we'll come back to them at the end. So with that, up next, we have a recording from Jessica Zuzak, who is a local environmental educator. She is going to share about turkey vultures, who are very big and very scary looking, and they eat dead things, but they're actually fascinating birds. So here's Jessica.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you tonight virtually. My name is Jessica Zuzak, and I'll be talking with you this evening about turkey vultures. Just to introduce myself, I'm originally from Western Pennsylvania, but moved to the area in 2019 to complete a master's degree at SOU in environmental education. And I finished that up in December and have been working at the John Muir Outdoor School. Okay, so turkey vultures are really common. We see them often soaring above, and they're somewhat unremarkable by their appearance, but they have some really redeeming qualities and play a hugely important ecological role. And I hope you get to see that throughout this presentation. So their scientific name, Cathartes aura, means purifier in Latin, or cleansing breeze. And their geographic range is from the southern part of Canada all the way through the Americas down to the southernmost tip of South America. And they can be found in a variety of habitats, from forested areas to open grasslands, urban and suburban, deserts, you name it, pretty much, they can be found there. During courtship, A group of turkey vultures will gather on the ground and hop about, and potential pairs will fly together in the sky and kind of mimic each other's flight patterns. There can be some complicated wing movements that they mimic for each other, and that can last for a few hours on end. A typical clutch size when mating does occur is about 2 to 3 of these kind of largish cream and brown mottled eggs. And turkey vultures do not actually build nest structures. However, they do find sheltered areas to lay their eggs. So this could be a hollowed out tree trunk, or a area around a rock crevice, or even an old building. And parents do take part in sharing the carrying of their young, and juveniles take about 90 days to reach independence. So some identifying features, they're pretty easy to spot. They, soar up in the sky with kind of this wobbly movement, rocking movement. You can see these really pronounced finger-like feathers at the end of their wings. And of course, the iconic red bald head, which is where the name turkey vulture comes from, because it is similar to that of the red head of the turkey. There's some dispute on whether or not turkey vultures are true raptors, and morphological and genetic studies have actually shown that they're probably more related to the stork rather than other birds of prey. And you can see this in some of their features. So turkey vulture feet are actually very similar to chicken's feet, more similar than birds of prey. So you can see the turkey vulture here, it has pretty short toes on the either side, and especially that back toe is pretty short as well. The talons are fairly small in addition. Compared to a bird of prey, you have some really strong, long toes, especially that back toe, and really pronounced long, sharp talons. And of course, this is used for grasping and piercing prey. Turkey vultures don't do that, so they don't need those hefty toes. They also don't have a brow bone shading their eyes. So you can see from this picture here, the eye is open, and they don't have that kind of angry look like a bird of prey often does, because they don't have that pronounced eye brow bone. And this is because they don't find their prey, their meals, primarily by sight. They use their incredible sense of smell. You can see another interesting feature here is their pervious nostril. So you can see right through the nostril here, and this is actually a bony structure that protects the turkey vulture's nostrils from being from getting blocked by what they're eating. Since turkey vultures are scavengers, they eat dead animals or carrion that they find, and their incredible sense of smell can allow them to smell carrion from over a mile away and from several hundred feet up in the sky. They will sometimes soar and circle above for hours on end using thermal lifts to keep afloat. And they can actually smell only 24 hours old. So they choose carrion that is less than 24 hours old. They do have a very strong stomach acids and a very strong immune system that allows them to eat dead animals without getting sick. And they will also eat a variety of dead animals, including other birds, reptiles, amphibians, and other mammals. Their bald head also allows them to keep clean when they are feeding. So sometimes they will have to, stick their head inside of a carcass, and that bald head lacking the feathers prevents flesh from sticking to their feathers. So they do have some sanitary features to them. Okay, so some of their behavior, they roost together in what's called a committee, and they soar together in a kettle. They lack a syrinx to make songs or calls. So their sounds are actually more like grunts or hisses. And they are silent for the most part, except for when they are feeding and vying for a better spot. So here is an audio of a turkey vulture hiss. All right. You can often see them with their wings spread partially out, standing on the ground or a post or something like that, and they are sunning themselves to warm up their body temperature from the long cold night. They do defecate on their legs to cool down. They lack sweat glands, so they need some other liquid to help with evaporative cooling, and that happens to be it. And because of their strong stomach acids, it's also thought to be a way of washing their feet from bacteria from during feeding too. They will also vomit on predators when they feel threatened. And I've read some sources that say that they can hurl their vomit 10 feet in a direction. So don't want to mess with these turkey vultures. And so they have a huge ecological role to play. And they're often called nature's cleanup crew, and that's a really fitting nickname for them. They keep the environments clean of dead carcasses. In doing so, they help keep the spread of disease in check. They can also help find natural gas leaks. So since natural gas is typically naturally odorless, gas companies add a smelly chemical in there called ethyl mercaptan, and this has a similar smell to rotting flesh. And since it's a similar smell to carrion, what they're looking for anyways, if you see a group of turkey vultures around a natural gas pipeline, then you might have a leak. Some threats to turkey vultures, of course, climate change is shifting their range. Pesticides, herbicides, drugs for livestock especially remain a threat to turkey vultures. Lead poisoning as well. Turkey vultures can feed on innards or parts of animals that were hunted if the hunter used lead-based ammunition and didn't remove any fragments or couldn't find all the fragments before disposing of the parts of the animal, then they could be inadvertently, causing lead poisoning in turkey vultures. Car collisions, of course, is another threat. Electrocution also, as they fly high up in the sky and are soaring, they can sometimes come into contact with power lines. And like I mentioned earlier, we do have a negative association in popular culture around turkey vultures. Turkey vultures are not symbols of death and impending doom, even though they do eat dead animals, but they in turn, by doing that, really help to maintain healthy ecosystems for humans and for other mammals and all around. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is, we might get an even split. Folks who are like, yeah, turkey vultures are so awesome. And folks who are like, wow, they projectile vomit. I'm not sure that I love them anymore. But I thought that was fascinating. So thank you very much, Jessica. Now, up next, we have got Emma Rose Parker, who is a biologist and an experienced snake handler. It is true that Western rattlesnakes are the only venomous snake in our region, and it's important to give them their space, but there is a lot to love about these reptiles. So I'm going to hand it over to Emma Rose.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here and get this going. Alrighty. Hang on. Perfect. Yeah, so first off, I figure I'll start with a little introduction about me and why I'm here talking to y'all about rattlesnakes. And and sort of, about why I love them so much. Rattlesnakes are and always have been one of my favorite species in the region. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about them. But first, as Tara said, I'm Emma Rose Parker. I'm an AmeriCorps member with the Nature Conservancy. I'm actually a volunteer coordinator. And so you might be wondering, what is a volunteer coordinator doing telling us about snakes? And the answer to that lies mostly with my father, Dr. Michael Parker, who is a professor of biology at Southern Oregon University. And I'll get the photo credit out of the way. Every single photo in this PowerPoint, except for one, came from his herpetology class. So thanks to Pop for all of these wonderful photos and videos. But yeah, I grew up with helping my dad out in the field. I think my first encounter with a rattlesnake was when I was probably 7 or 8 in my 3rd grade teacher's chicken coop and almost stepped on one. And at the time, I didn't really understand why my teacher was like, thank goodness it was your child who almost stepped on the rattlesnake. And I was like, well, it didn't hurt me. Nobody got bitten. Not a big deal, right? Super cool. And I didn't understand until later sort of the way that rattlesnakes are vilified. So moving along, I can give y'all a brief overview of where we're headed with this talk. It's not super complex. I'm going to give you some tips for identification and then share some really, really interesting natural history facts about these snakes. And so, starting with how to identify them, I think probably the easiest place to start is with the rattle. All rattlesnakes have rattles, but not all rattlesnakes can rattle. So the juveniles will have just a tiny little 1-segment button at the end of their tail that can't actually make any noise. But the adults will have multiple different segments. And the way that those form actually is each time the rattlesnake sheds, it sheds its skin in order to grow. And a little nubbin sort of stays on the end. And so the rattle is actually a bunch of sections of interlocking old skin, basically. And they when you shake it, it makes this buzzing, rattling noise. Other diagnostic features for this snake, definitely the triangular shaped head. There's not really another snake in this region that has that like traditional, the traditional viper shaped head. And so these snakes really have a very distinctive triangular head. Vertical pupils, they are nocturnal. And so their pupils will be vertical. All the other snakes that look sort of similar in this region are diurnal. And so their eyes are really big and they don't have the vertical pupil. And then the scales on these snakes are really, really rough. They're called keeled. They have this little like hard bit down the center of them. And so if it looks rough, that's another good diagnostic feature. And finally, all rattlesnakes will have this black and white banding at the bottom. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but that's a really diagnostic characteristic of this disruptive coloration at the base of the tail. And the reason for that coloration is they are preyed on by hawks and eagles and birds of prey. And so when they're slithering around, that coloring sort of distracts the prey and sort of camouflages the snake. So moving onward a little bit, there we go. So we have one species of rattlesnake in the region in Oregon, but they are so incredibly variable in color. As you can see, these two snakes are the same species, same subspecies even, found, maybe a couple of meters from one another out near the Steens Mountains in Oregon. And you can see they look very different. So rattlesnakes in this area, the coloration is super, super variable. but so you can sort of tell which subspecies you're dealing with by which area you're in the state. And so the subspecies that we have here in the Rogue Valley is the Pacific Northwest rattlesnake, so Crotalus oreganus oreganus. And then if you go a little farther east, if you're in the southeast part of the state, then you'll be dealing with the Great Basin rattlesnake, so Crotalus viridis lutosus. But they're all part of the same species. You know, they're just different categories. And these snakes, actually, they're not just unique to Oregon. They span all the way west from Oregon and Northern California out into the middle of the country. You can find them in Texas. And they go, you know, north up into Canada, up into British Columbia, and yeah, sort of south into the southernmost regions of the United States as well. So they're not just in Oregon. But I feel kind of excited that the species name mentions Oregon, right? Oreganus. So moving on, here we have a video of a rattlesnake that I will play in just a moment. This is footage from my father. If you listen carefully, you'll be able to hear him get very excited. So yeah, I'll go ahead and play the video.
Nice. Go ahead. Get defensive. Sweet.
And so I think the thing that I really want to highlight with this video is you can sort of see how close my dad is to this snake. I love him very much, but you can definitely tell he's not using the zoom function on his phone to zoom into the snake. You know, so he's pretty close. And that snake, you'll notice, instead of trying to strike at him or be aggressive, it's backing up in this pretty standard defensive posture for most snakes. It's sort of this S shape with the head and the neck. And so that is in case it does need to strike. It gets a lot of power and a lot of momentum from that shape of its body. But biting and striking is really a last resort, especially for rattlesnakes. I'll move on. They are what we call sit and wait predators. And so basically they rely on their venom to subdue and kill their prey. They just wait for a little rodent or something to come along, and then they'll strike at it, wait for it to die. You know, it'll run off a little bit and die, and then they'll follow the trail and eat the rodent. And so that snake does not want to waste its venom on something as big as a human, as big as my dad, that it's not going to be able to eat. And, you know, that it probably won't even be able to kill. So biting is really a last resort. It doesn't want to waste venom on humans. It wants to use its venom to subdue its prey. Anyhow, so moving on from there, we have a couple of different photos in this slide. And the first thing that I want to say is that photo in the bottom center isn't a rattlesnake. That's actually a king snake. And king snakes are so named because they are actually immune to rattlesnake venom. And so they eat rattlesnakes. They don't seek them out, but they can and will prey on rattlesnakes. And they're immune to the venom because they have special antibodies in their blood that actually interferes with the way that the venom will attack the snake. So that's pretty cool. And then, you know, you have the top right and the bottom left are examples of young rattlesnakes. So the young of the year, these are snakes that were born, and I say born on purpose, within the year. They're very young snakes, and, you know, they look all shiny and new, which is another way to tell that they're young. They're also very small, about a foot in length, whereas an adult will be up to 3 feet or maybe 4 feet. But I do say born for a reason, and that's because rattlesnakes are what we call oviviparous, or ovoviviparous, sorry, pronunciation. But basically what that means is that rattlesnakes give birth to live young. And so the ovo part in that word, ovo meaning egg, so the rattlesnake actually grows eggs inside it, the female will, but then the eggs will hatch inside the female's body, and she will carry those eggs and then the hatched snakes around and actually give birth to live young. So the vivi, meaning alive, and then paris, to give birth to. So it's kind of this fascinating combination of like live birth and laying eggs. Really, really cool. Another really awesome thing about rattlesnakes is that they're what we call pit vipers. And so I will move forward. And I don't know if you can see in this photo down here, I should have pointed it out in an earlier slide because it was very clear then. They have this little pit on their face, which is a heat sensing pit. And so that's how they sense their prey, is they can sense heat. And so there's this really fascinating study that was done by Rundis et al., where they looked at California ground squirrels, because they noticed that California ground squirrels would often do this behavior where they would flag their tails when confronted with an adult rattlesnake. And so basically they just like frantically wave their tail in front of the snake and the snake would back off. And so the researchers were like, what is up with that? That's the weirdest thing we've ever seen. And what they figured out is actually happening is when an adult ground squirrel is flagging like that, it puts a lot of blood into its tail and basically heats its tail up a lot. And so it's letting that rattlesnake know, like, oh, I am a big adult ground squirrel. You're probably not going to be able to kill me with your venom. And even if you do, I'm going to get far enough away that you won't be able to eat me. And so rattlesnakes will actually back off from large adult ground squirrels because they know even if they do envenomate the squirrel, even if it does eventually die, it's going to be too big for the snake to be able to follow. And this figure that I included in this slide I think it's so fascinating because the photo on the right, the snake on the right, isn't a rattlesnake. It's a lookalike. Actually, this is a gopher snake, Pichilophus catenifer. And this is the one photo in the PowerPoint that I took that my father did not. But so they did this study where they confronted the ground squirrels with a rattlesnake versus a gopher snake. And so figure A on the top left is when the ground squirrel was confronted with the rattlesnake. And you can see this heat diagram. Its tail shows up super hot. And so it's really trying to show the snake that, like, yeah, I'm big, don't mess with me. Whereas in the bottom, figure B, this squirrel was confronted with a gopher snake, and the squirrel knows its tail is not hot at all. It didn't do the flagging behavior. So it could tell the difference between the two species, and it knew that, oh, a gopher snake is a constrictor, so it's gonna eat me no matter what. But a rattlesnake, is a pit viper. It senses my heat, and it's not going to constrict, and its venom might not be strong enough to kill me, so it's not going to try. The really fascinating part about this is that juvenile ground squirrels, ones that are small enough that the rattlesnake most definitely will be able to kill it with its venom, those ones don't display the flagging behavior. So that's just a really fascinating study about rattlesnakes. Moving along, I have another video for y'all. This is, again, out in Eastern Oregon, the Great Basin rattlesnake, subspecies of the Western rattlesnake. And this one is cool. I want to point out the tail, the disruptive coloration on the tail right here. But yeah, I'll go ahead and play the video.
Hey, buddy.
Oh, All righty, and that's it for me. Oh, real quick, I'll point out this. Here's the heat sensing pit. You can really see it in that photo. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for coming, and I hope you learned something.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. I love that we're getting a spotlight on creatures that, like, I'll be honest, I'm a little afraid of rattlesnakes, but maybe next time I see one, I won't panic. So thank you for that, Emma Rose. Now, up next, we have got another Southern Oregon Land Conservancy staff member, our very own Olivia Hammer, and she brings her experience as a forest ecologist to her work as a land steward for us at SOLC. And she is going to be talking about snags and dead wood. These are often cited as fire hazards or fall hazards or just eyesores. And so they're often pulled out of forests, but Lindia will tell us why they are a critical part of a forest ecosystem. Lindia.
Hello, fine people. My name is Olivia Hammer. I'm a forest ecologist and lover of nature, wildlife enthusiast. I have the wonderful opportunity to talk with you for a few minutes today about one of my favorite subjects, which is dead wood. And following with the theme of the night, the title of my presentation is Dead Wood, Show Some Respect. I really like seeing dead wood. I like it to see it standing up as a snag, lying on the ground. Both are conserving moisture, harboring fungi, and kind of ugly little insects. Strange little creepy crawlies that do really important work as decomposers and form the base of the food chain for so many other critters. That dead wood also provides cover and shelter and food and helpful microclimate for modern day dinosaurs like this western fence lizard and what I believe is a juvenile Ensatina. It's just lying under a little, I picked up a little piece of surface wood the other day out in the Illinois Valley, and there it was, motionless, kind of chilly, finding shelter under a simple scrap of wood. I also really love to see dead wood when it's all polished up and beautiful, like these sanded cross sections. I love just the beauty and the strength, the material of the wood, but when polished like this, not only can you see the annual growth record, those annual growth rings, the alternating light and dark, which is the light is the spring growth and the dark is the fall growth. You can see that annual growth cycle, but you can see where the tree was wounded and it started to grow over that wound. And I think that's pretty remarkable. The center picture is an oak. They're especially good at closing over wounds. And then inside where that wound started, often a cavity will form. That's one of the things that makes oaks so valuable for wildlife. And then on either side, those are both cross sections of cedar that happens to be a juniper species that grows east of the Rockies. I even like to see dead wood when it looks kind of like some trash that someone should clean up. I often hear folks refer to wood on the ground as, trash or something that needs to be cleaned up. And so let's spend a few minutes celebrating dead wood, even when it looks kind of ugly. Like what else can we see in it besides kind of a mess? And let's also talk about dead wood and fire. Speaking of fire, looking at these two slides, the dead wood on the left, that stuff's all touching the ground for the most part. And when a fire rolls through here, the fire is going to burn up the little stuff, the needles. It's going to go into those conifers in the back. It might even kind of, at first, when the fire's blowing through, it might even kind of skip that wood because there's nothing leafy to catch and quickly ignite. That's all stuff that holds moisture, and it's slower to catch, and it sits there and smolders. It's not the material that fire managers look at and think about at what's actively pushing or carrying, moving, conveying that fire across the landscape. That's the fine leafy stuff that can either be on the ground or in low branches, and in some cases goes all the way up into the canopy. It is true that snags can ignite, they can torch up, they can put some sparks up into the upper canopy, but the same thing can happen with live trees. So there's a little bit of, I think, a disproportionate concern about dead wood. In our forests, in our region, southwestern Oregon, the greater Klamath-Siskiyous, really it's what I've seen in my years out in the woods is that it's an overabundance of smaller diameter, particularly Doug fir, that's very widespread across our landscape, that has come in following logging, has somewhat altered the character of our forests, the patchy nature, and that's what's conveying the fire across the landscape. Not that dead wood doesn't burn, but I'm asking you to start to maybe think about putting on a wildlife lens, not just viewing the forest from a fuel lens. Moving on, so don't talk about combustible trees for too long here. We're looking at a tree swallow in a cavity. I believe it's a tree swallow, a cavity that a woodpecker, some other primary excavator, excavated, so that all the secondary cavity dwellers like swallows, owls, birds, bats, mammals in some cases that can't actually drill into a tree and excavate their own hole can use. The other photo is that was taken, I took that photo during a prescribed fire, and there was a little bit of exposed wood from an old fire scar that was able to catch and smolder and slowly burn. And I don't know what the fate of that individual was, if a firefighter put that out or let it burn out. Here's another example of just a sapsucker using a cavity, and then the other tree actually harbored a turkey vulture nest. That was at the Rogue River Preserve. Frank Lost Pluto, local bird biologist and photographer, captured that. I just want to encourage you to think about, look at this messiness as richness. That's how our wildlife look at it. I feel like I skipped some important things, but here we are at a video that will talk a little bit more about snags and deadwood as ecosystems. So I'd like to share this with you now. Thanks.
Well, when you first look at a dead tree like this, you might think widowmaker, just taking up space in the forest. When we talk about people as being dead wood, it's not exactly a compliment, but in fact, these have extraordinary value for any number of different species. Some larger ones that we're familiar with, well, woodpeckers, and large enough a bear might find a cavity inside one of these. Squirrels, bats, the list of birds and mammals goes on and on. Smaller things, various frogs and salamanders will be in the cracks and under the bark and such, and then very small things, little insects and fungi and all sorts of things that sometimes it's hard to understand the value of these things, but they're all part of a larger ecosystem. They have a role in decomposing organic matter like this and the like. It really is extraordinary, the diversity of things that one can find here. There's two groups of beetles, longhorn beetles and metallic wood borer beetles. These groups are uniquely associated with deadwood, and worldwide there's tens of thousands of species of these two kinds of beetles uniquely associated with deadwood. That makes them more diverse than all the birds, all the reptiles, all the mammals, all the amphibians on Earth times two, uniquely associated with this thing called a snag, a log, whatever you will. There's a special place, a special little microenvironment within the forest.
Dr. Malcolm Hunter, clearly a appreciate snags as much as I do, which I very much appreciate. I marveled when I saw this video at the idea that tens of thousands of beetles, there are tens of thousands of different beetle species that evolved to utilize this deadwood resource. That globally, that means deadwood has been very abundant on Earth for tens of thousands of years. In North America and in our region, we have similarly thousands of wildlife species and other organisms that have evolved to depend on this deadwood resource that was once very abundant. You know, our historic regime of fire in our region both cultivated and consumed deadwood in vast quantities. And our land management of the last 100 to 200 years is very new for this ecosystem, where we've preferentially removed this dead material. We prefer, younger, fast-growing forests that we can utilize for wood fiber as a whole. So where does that leave us? We are concerned about fire risk, and we want to keep our wildlife around the relatively small populations of wildlife that we still have in North America that have been here for tens of thousands of years. How do we protect them and protect our homes? Well, we see the material around our homes as fuels. We do what we need to do to protect our homes. But as we gain distance from our home, from our community, from the roadside, we can try to put on that wildlife habitat lens and see if we can see the messiness, the messy shrub, vine, deadwood tangles as something other than fuel. And we can put those lenses together and add in a long-term, a fire history and forest ecology lens, and a fuels and forest management lens, along with our wildlife lens. And we can make strategic decisions to protect that wildlife habitat, that messy, critical wildlife habitat, while also being safe around our homes and communities. Let's see. Yes. Here's a Brewer sparrow, another photo by Frank on top of a lovely shrub. A wood thrush, rather unusual for our region, utilizing some dead wood. And finally a sapsucker here, all urging you to show some respect for dead wood. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Lindia. I think that that's especially timely right here in the Ashland and Talent area, as we see what's becoming of so many of those trees that we lost in the fires. So it's lots of food for thought, and hopefully food for our wildlife. Now, to end our evening, we have a very special treat. Tyrone Wilson is an actor with Ashland's own Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and he recorded a reading of a love poem to rot and decay and decomposition. The poem is called Geocentric. It's written by Patty Ann Rogers, and here he is.
Indecent, self-soiled, billowous reek of turnip and toadstool decay, dribbling the black oil of wilted succulents, the brown fester of rotting orchards in plain view, that stain of stinkhorn down your front, that leaking roil of bracket fungi down your back, you purpled hair, grainy fuzz smolder of refuse, fathering fumes and boils and powdery mildews, enduring the constant interruption of sink mire flatulence, contagious with earwax, corn smut, blister rust, backwash and graveyard debris, rich with manure bog and dry rot, harboring not only egg-addled garbage and the wrinkled lip of orange peel mold, but also the clotted breath of overripe radish and burnt leek, bearing every dank, malodorous rot and scarp, all sulfur fissues and fetid hillside seepages. Old dependable, engendering forever the stench and stretch and warm seeth of inevitable putrefaction. Nobody loves you as I do.
And with that, we have come to the end of our program. I will say stick around for Q&A because we have got some really wonderful questions for our speakers. And before we get into that, I also want to remind you that the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy is a community-supported organization. You can visit our website, www.landconserve.org. I will put that in the chat for you right here. You can donate online. You can become a member today. You can also find all of our upcoming events. We've got an Open Lands Day in June. Sooner than that, we've got our conservation celebration in May and a stewardship day in the first week of June. We've got lots of stuff going on, and we would love to see you at some of our future events. This recording will be posted on our Facebook and YouTube sites, pages. Feel free to share it with friends, go back and watch a second time, maybe learn a little bit more. And thank you so much again for joining us this evening. We are so delighted to be able to share all of these voices with you in our online speaker series. So with that, I'm going to get into some questions for our speakers. And we'll go back to the beginning. Kristi, someone has asked, I get poison oak just looking at it. How is that possible?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you all hear me okay? Well, you are not getting poison oak by looking at the luscious leaves. It's impossible. However, you are likely getting it from the fur of a cat or a dog, or on inanimate objects like steering wheels, your partner's clothing, tables and chairs, in which it can be persistent for a long time. One study showed that it can be on surfaces for many years. 100-year-old herbarium sample of poison oak from when touched has given people rashes. So you do have to be exposed to the allergen. Good question. And I'm so sorry you're allergic.
And wow, that's amazing that the oil can last for that long. Good to know. Nothing is safe. And Kristi, will you just confirm for us, does mistletoe damage the oaks? What's like, is it hurting the oaks?
Think about it as just one of many stressors: insects, fungi, drought. But also think about the beautiful, gigantic oaks you see that are over 200 years old, covered in mistletoe. Also keep in mind that many oak trees, old oak trees, survive their mistletoe infestations. So mistletoes are a stressor, and they can create cavities and fissures and swollen branches, but it's amazing wildlife habitat. So you can love your oaks and you can love your oak mistletoe.
I love that. We're coming back to Lindia's lens of, thinking about it from a wildlife lens, not just a people-centric lens. So thank you. All right. Oh, and we have another question about getting poison oak. Can you get poison oak from the wind blowing by you from like next to a poison oak?
That would be very ominous if you're highly allergic. Uh, no, not that I have seen any research on. However, during wildfires, the oils can be on smoke particles. It never aerosol. It's never like aerosol, and smoke with poison oak oils can be a big issue.
Thank you. Okay, so mostly as long as you stay on the trail, as long as the trail has been cleared back of poison oak, you'll be fine, even if it's a windy day. All right, so I'm gonna move on. We have a couple of questions for Olivia. And let's see, the first one is, are there any differences besides life history between those two distinct populations of chaparral? So you talked about the fire adapted seeds, but are there any other differences between the two?
It's not very well studied. The last I heard, there was a researcher based out of California, I'm thinking UC Santa Cruz maybe, who was requesting seeds from the Rogue Valley to study differences in seed germination with Ceanothus cuneatus in Southwest Oregon and further south. So stay tuned on that for more research. Like a lot of natural history items, not very well understood.
Awesome, thank you. And we have a question about a large buckbrush in someone's yard, and it says the top third or quarter of it seems to be dead, but the rest is blooming and looking great. Is there anything I should do to help it, or is this just part of its life cycle and it's okay?
As far as I know, well, what I've observed is that chaparral shrubs tend to be very shade intolerant. So particularly the branches in the lower part of the canopy tend to get shaded out and die. They also are really easily killed by shade from overstory trees like oaks or pines or some other conifers that are growing above them. If that's not the issue, then I've also read that pruning is not the best for those species. It can introduce fungi into the wounds. That said, I've got several Ceanothus in my front yard that are blooming right now, and they're just absolutely beautiful, and I prune them all the time. So yeah, I'd be curious if one of those are the issues, but other than that, good luck.
Great, thank you. And another question for you, last one. What did the Native Americans do with the berries from the chaparral? Did they use those?
Yes, they were eaten. I believe they are a source of vitamin C. I have tried them myself and did not find them all that tasty, but I very well could have not harvested them at the right time or not prepared them correctly. I believe that the leaves were considered medicinal and that the wood can be used for things like pipes and carving. It's also very dense, contains a lot of energy, and so is excellent fuel wood. There are other people on this call that are experts in such matters, and if we have time, maybe somebody else wants to chime in as well.
Or if
No
you
pressure.
have more information, maybe put it in the chat box. That would
Good
be
idea.
awesome. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, Jessica, you're up. Just how big is a turkey vulture's wingspan?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's about 6 feet. So during the whole, social distancing time, it's a great visual. So, and we actually have used that as a cue for students at the John Muir School. Turkey vulture, spread your wings out and you're 6 feet apart, unless you're a kindergartner, which would not have a 6 foot wingspan, I would hope.
Awesome. And do turkey vulture heads get like sunburned, bug bites, other hassles that feathers would otherwise protect them from? Like, is there a
That is a
trade-off to not
really
getting guts stuck in your feathers?
right. That's a really great question, and I actually had to look that up myself too. But what I found is that turkey vultures and just bird skin in general is different than mammalian skin. So where our skin would get sunburned, bird skin is more closely related to reptile skin because of that, descendants from reptiles. And so if you think about it that way, you don't see lizards and snakes getting sunburnt. They, love being out in the sun. And so just on a cellular level, skin is different, and so we'll react differently to those conditions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for looking that up for us.
Yeah.
And where do they migrate to and from?
Yeah. So there are, various different ranges depending on the subspecies, but in general, turkey vultures can be found from southern Canada all the way to the southernmost tip of South America. So all the way down. The subspecies that we would see around here, the Cathartes or meridionales, I think that's what it's called, or the western turkey vulture, is going to be within that range, but stay within the western part of the United States.
Awesome. Thank you. And our final question for you. So confirm for us, it is that like giant whole nose that lets them find carcasses from very far away.
Yeah, and actually some information that I didn't include in my presentation was that turkey vultures have one of the largest olfactory bulbs per relative to brain size of any bird. And so done that found that the olfactory bulb of turkey vultures is 4 times as big as that of the black vulture, and that they have about twice as much mitral cells. So those are the cells that that process information about smell and transmit it to the brain. So they have on a, again, on a cellular level, they have that advantage of for their smell. So yes, it is primarily smell, how they find their food.
That is a really remarkable adaptation.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Super specific. All right. Thank you, Jessica. Emma Rose, I've got a couple for you now. We have 2 color questions. One is, why do some rattlesnakes have a green tint to their skin? And the other is, a rattlesnake's tongue really blue?
Yeah, both great questions. And I can't say that I actually know off the top of my head why some rattlesnakes are greenish in color. I would imagine probably to help stay camouflaged. That reptiles in general like to hide and not get eaten, and so I would imagine that that's an adaptation to sort of match their habitat. Yeah, and then, sorry. Oh, are their tongues actually blue? Yes, from what I've seen, yes. They do have blue tongues. It's wild, and a lot of snakes actually do have blue tongues, and I do not know why.
And you have been close enough to a rattlesnake to personally confirm that its tongue is blue.
I have, yes.
Great.
Not the Western rattlesnake, but Eastern diamondback rattlesnake. I've held one, so.
Okay, yes. I'm very impressed. Now I have a couple more questions for you. 2 about young rattlesnakes. First one is, how long does this super fascinating gestation of like inside the mother in an egg to live birth, how long is that gestation period?
Oh, that is a great question. And I want to say around like 6-ish weeks, but maybe check that. Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. And then our last question for you is, Is it a myth that young rattlesnakes cannot control their venom and are therefore more dangerous? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is a myth. It's a widely spread myth, yeah, and you know, I don't know if there's actually been research done on whether juvenile rattlesnakes can control their venom or not, but if you think about the size variation between a juvenile rattlesnake and an adult rattlesnake, the venom duct in that juvenile is going to be so small. So even if it can't control its venom, which we're pretty sure that it can, because you know, if it's wasting venom on every single thing it bites, it's not going to be able to have enough to eat and will quickly die, because they really rely on that venom to catch their prey. And so yeah, the juvenile rattlesnakes are so small that they are not, they don't have as much venom to give in general. And yeah, so I don't know if that makes sense.
Perfect sense. Thank you. I am reassured.
Awesome. Yes, no worries.
All right. Thank you so much, Emma Rose. And now, Lindia, we've got a couple of questions for you. When trees are black on the outside from a fire, does that mean that they're eventually going to die, or might they at some point recover and start producing leaves and putting on new growth?
Either one. Those can all be true, all those scenarios you just described. So this is a great time of year to look closely at blackened trees. Christy and I were just looking at oaks in the open chain fire area today, and there's a range from black, charred, scorched, all the way to gray, where there was so much heat that the bark is covered in ash. But the oaks are just leafing out depending on your elevation. So I don't know what species the person was asking about, but you have to look at the leaves. And then for some of the species, you have to look at the ground, because maybe the canopy has died, but you might see the resprout, especially with hardwoods. You're going to see young sprouts coming up.
Awesome. So that's just like a wait and see. It's really hard to know if a tree is going to make a comeback or not.
Yep, that's definitely a wait and see.
Awesome. And then our last question for you, for private landowners, if they are doing ecological thinning or fuels reduction, how many snags per acre should they consider retaining for wildlife? Like, what's the historical condition on that?
Oh, that's interesting. And the historical condition, I know of a study that tried to get at that by proxy by looking at unmanaged old stands, old in age stands, and found that in our region, it varies quite a lot with elevation and plant community. So anywhere from 0 to 20 snags per acre, and quite a lot more downwood. There was also a huge range with downwood, but 10 to 100 pieces per acre. Anyway, it's highly variable. I've seen federal lands management recommendations 2 to 3 per acre. Some other wildlife best management practices 4 to 6 per acre. It just really depends on, what you've got and what you can do. You don't want one to fall on your house.
Fair enough. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lindia. And that wraps up all of our questions, and that wraps up our evening. As you are filtering out, we would encourage you to put into the chat box if there is a plant or animal species that you really admire, you, the audience members, that you really love, you really admire, and you think it doesn't get the respect that it deserves. We would love to hear about it on your way out the door. And again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was wonderful to have you all here, and come back, visit us often, tune in for our future events, and take care, everyone.